Have you lost yourself and your identity in a toxic relationship and you don't even know how it happened? And perhaps you've never felt a concrete sense of who you are, feeling a bit lost like a shell of a person, and you want to find yourself for the first time? Today I'm going to show you why your identity is the first thing to go in a toxic relationship and how to start picking up the pieces to find yourself again. This is a process I went through when, after years of toxic relationships, I felt like a shell of a person who'd been self-abandoning my whole life. I learned step by step how to form my identity from the ground up and now have a strong, solid, loving sense of myself, and I use the wisdom of my past to inform the conscious choices I now make to create an incredibly beautiful and peaceful life. If this is something you want to learn how to do, I encourage you to book a call to speak with me as I teach these skills successfully to women all over the world. When you've been in a toxic relationship, in order to stay in that relationship, you have to axe off and ignore and forget parts of yourself in order to remain in it. The very fact that the relationship is unhealthy, causing you stress and strain, there's abuse, lying, manipulation, means that things are fundamentally not okay for you. And those parts that are telling you things aren't okay are the parts you're ignoring and abandoning. By staying in a relationship like this, you learn to ignore yourself, either unconsciously because you're in love with them, or that person is maybe grooming you to ignore yourself in the form of gaslighting. Saying phrases to you like, "What I said was a joke," or "You're overreacting, you're too needy." These are all phrases a gaslighter uses to get you to question yourself and to ignore the parts of yourself that would normally speak up and say, "Something's not right here, I don't trust what he's saying." You're ignoring and axing off those parts of yourself in order to believe what he's saying, whether you're aware of it or not. And when you don't trust yourself, you learn to overvalue what his reality is instead of valuing your own reality and identity. Now, if we were to pull a random person off the street, they'd say, "Why on earth would you stay in a toxic relationship? Like, why would you stay? It doesn't make sense for someone to stay with someone who's treating them poorly, abuse, manipulating, lying, cheating on them. Just leave," this person would say. It doesn't make sense to someone who doesn't have issues with their self-worth and self-esteem. But if you have any kind of abandonment or attachment trauma, it does make sense. And here's why. If you grew up in an environment where there was gaslighting or emotional manipulation or neglect from your primary caregivers, and this can just look like parents who aren't emotionally available, who don't know how to hold space for your emotions, and they might tell you what you're feeling is wrong and they shut you down. Or maybe your parents just didn't show up for you at all and you experienced abandonment. These create conditions within you that cause you to not trust yourself or your senses. You become so externally focused in order to feel safe in an unsafe environment, and you externalize your perception and cling on to whatever you need to feel like everything's okay. Connection becomes more important to your survival than identity, and this is a subconscious mechanism. You're not aware when you're doing it because a lot of our identity comes from how we connect to others because we're pack animals. Connection overrides authenticity. So in a childhood environment where you don't feel seen, heard, and valued by just simply being yourself, which allows you to grow a strong sense of self and identity, you will sacrifice that in order to stay connected to your primary caregivers. That's where we learn this instinct of self-abandonment that we then translate into adult relationships. So back to the person on the street who didn't experience this, right? They have secure attachment. If they ended up in a relationship like this that turned toxic, they would simply walk away because they know their worth and they don't accept or tolerate behavior like that. Whereas someone with attachment trauma who grew up with this kind of treatment, you're wired to live with it and even be attracted to it, which makes it almost impossible to walk away from because your abandonment trauma is so strongly attached to them. Now, toxic relationships often start off wonderfully, right? You finally feel loved and chosen by them, but this person is probably showing you huge gestures of love, maybe even love bombing you, and you believe it because you so desperately want to feel loved and chosen because you didn't feel this way when you were young. You don't feel lovable just as you are. You need others to tell you that, and you tend to attract people who go over the top telling you that, which is why you keep attracting narcissistic types and emotionally unavailable people who are really good at giving this kind of attention at the beginning. That's why the honeymoon stage of a toxic relationship feels so normal to you, because there's been so much scarcity of feeling being loved and chosen in your life. You've historically never felt good enough because of your attachment trauma. It feels like you finally met someone who's choosing you. Whereas the person off the street who knows what it's like to be loved and feels worthy of love would be turned off by such extreme gestures of love because they'd think, how can you love me? You don't even know me. So toxic relationships are formed on these exaggerated expressions of love, which are not authentic. They can't be maintained. It is a front. That person is putting on a show, like a bird doing a feathered display to attract a mate and then disappearing once they've gotten what they wanted. That's effectively what's happening in the honeymoon stage of a toxic relationship, right? Once the man gets what he wants, and this is a simplification to a degree, the love bombing disappears and what you're left with is a completely different person. Or this might happen slowly, like the frog in the pot of lukewarm water. At first, the relationship's going great, and when the cracks start to show, things don't seem so bad, right? The great times are so great, so you excuse the little toxic things that start happening. But they start getting worse and you don't notice how hot the water is around you until it is boiling because you've acclimatized to it. You've been making excuses for their behavior, being overly compassionate and understanding, and in the process slowly losing parts of who you are to stay with a person treating you badly. If you carry deep feelings of unworthiness or abandonment issues from childhood, these beliefs will lead you into relationship dynamics where you lose your identity, like codependency. In codependency, your identity becomes wrapped up in the role you play in the relationship. So you're the caregiver, the fixer. You're always attracted to partners who need fixing, project partners, because you feel needed when you're fixing, because deep down, you don't feel worthy of someone who's your equal. You find purpose and identity in that role of the caretaker. Another dynamic that contributes to losing your identity is people pleasing and avoiding conflict. This is where you suppress your needs and feelings and boundaries and like walking on eggshells to avoid conflict, especially if the person you're with has a volatile personality. These are all behaviors that force you to suppress who you are, and before you know it, you've lost yourself in the relationship. So what do you do if you've lost your identity in a toxic relationship and maybe you've never had a strong sense of identity in the first place? I know this is the case for me in my story. I didn't always feel like I belonged, like I was the black sheep. I thought there was something inherently wrong with me. I felt like I was always on the outside looking in, like other people were functioning normally and I wasn't. What allowed me to shift and change and really grow my identity was to heal the parts within me that were keeping me separate from other healthy people and to stop clinging to toxic partners. I was able to heal that energy within me, and that gave me space to grow authentic connections with myself and with others, which helped me form a more solid sense of self. Because honestly, we can't grow a strong identity in a vacuum. We can do a lot of work on our own, but a strong sense of place in the world comes from connecting with others in healthy ways. And that is what helps grow a strong identity. So let's talk about what that looks like and how to do that. The first way I started to get a sense of self after leaving my toxic relationship, and from a lifetime of not really knowing who I was through personal narrative, writing my own story. This was a self-reflective process because I'd previously been muddling through life with blinders on, just living in the moment, not really thinking about where I'd come from or where I was going. I didn't have any goals or any self-trust to fulfill those goals. I wasn't following through with what I said I was going to do, and I was constantly letting myself down. My identity was like a formless cloud or haze. It had no solid aspect to it. And I felt like I was a chameleon. I was easily influenced by others because I was just so externally focused. Once I started to really look back at the trajectory of my life, the arc of my life, from where I'd been, and began to read things like The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell or others' biographies, and learnt about archetypes, which are recurring patterns of personalities and roles and behaviors across different cultures, I realized that my personal journey was actually not unique. I wasn't such a special snowflake. I was actually walking a path many had walked before me and making a lot of mistakes people before me had made. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we all grow, right? And I connected with the similarities between what was going on in my self-actualization and the stories of others who had gone through the same journey. This was my first inroad to writing my own personal narrative of where I'd come from. It wasn't anything special. It just looked like me journaling and drawing. I drew out a timeline of my relationships because romantic relationships have always been the deepest medicine for me. I looked at the quality of them and how they impacted me at the time in the context of where I was developmentally and what was going on for me. And honestly, this was really hard because I did struggle with my memory growing up because of the complex PTSD. But the lens I used from present day Amy to look back at past Amy was a beautiful medicine. I was picking up those fragments of who I was back then, and then I'd bring them along with me and I'd really reparent that part of myself. I'd say to that part, it made sense that you did that back then. I can see why. Look how important it was that you went through that in order for you to be where you are now. It was kind of like I'd been leaving fragments of glass on my trail, and I was finally taking stock of them all and picking up the most important pieces and piecing them together into a beautiful mosaic, which reminds me of the Japanese art of kintsugi, where they piece beautiful pieces of broken objects and turn them into a more beautiful piece than what they originally were. That process really helped me look at the reflection of my life and my identity in its current form. And I've continued that practice. It's one of the most important practices I have in evolving my identity, because identity changes and evolves. Story and meaning are inherent parts of how we express as human beings. And storytelling is a deep, primal part of who we are. And seeing the similarities between your story and others is incredibly healing, which is one aspect of why Heal Your Heart School is a group learning environment, because that medicine that comes with sharing and seeing similarities with others' journeys, unbeatable. The next thing I did to carve out my identity was to take a hard look at the kinds of decisions and actions I'd been taking up until that point, how I expressed myself in the world, how I behaved, and the kinds of decisions that I was making. Honestly, this was the hardest thing I've ever done because it was pretty ugly. It was messy. If I were to stand back and look at that person, at all the things she was deciding to do, think, and feel, I honestly didn't like her. And being honest with myself was like dunking my whole body into cold, icy water. It was that much of a rude shock. And of course, that makes sense because most of my life I'd been running from who I was, not willing to look at the poor quality of choices I was making or the lack of character and backbone I felt I had at the time. Now, the words I'm using to describe who I was back then are quite harsh, but it's not how I feel about myself now. At the time, it was, but I've now developed a lot of self-compassion for those versions of me that were just executing through behaviors I had learned, how I'd been socialized, coping mechanisms I'd engaged in just to survive in challenging environments. And now looking back, I can see how brilliant that mechanism was to focus so much on getting attention and validation from others because of the scarcity I felt, and I hadn't learnt skills of inner strength or self-trust or self-love. From an outside perspective, it was incredibly intelligent how I learnt to people please. It served an important function when I was young and trying to feel connected to survive. But of course, it caused a great deal of chaos in my relationships and in myself, because people pleasing does not work long term as an adult. So if you're watching this video and you're still in survival mode, I applaud you. You're doing what you need to do to keep yourself safe, but it doesn't have to be this way forever. There is a way out, which is why I'm making this video and why I do what I do. Understanding that all these decisions I made, what I now call poor, immature choices that lacked character and strength, actually served me a purpose. They kept me alive and connected in the only way I knew how at the time. And being honest with myself allowed me to see that, and it allowed me to identify what I wanted to do moving forward, because I knew how I didn't want to show up anymore. I could make conscious choices about how I wanted to act, what kind of character I wanted to develop, and how I wanted to show up for myself in relationships and in life. And I know that if I didn't make these decisions consciously, that old version of me will keep running the show, and I did not want that anymore. It's kind of like a contrast exercise where you see all the things you don't want because you've been doing them, and isn't that life, right? You figure out what you want by doing all the wrong things. You might do 10 wrong things and then stumble on one right thing, and that's how you get a taste for who you want to be. So you lean into that, and that leads you towards more of the kinds of things and the person that you want to be. That's how I started to solidify this feeling in my body of who I wanted to be. For example, I've always felt separate from people, like a loner, only having friendships with safe people who wouldn't call me on my bullshit. One of the things I learned was to feel safe in my body around people who triggered me, like a family member or someone I felt jealous of. I learned how to stay in my body around them, and that allowed me to stay connected to myself and others without the need to run away. This allowed me better understanding of the dynamics in those kinds of relationships, which helped me understand myself better because I could actually be with what was being triggered inside of me and work with that. I began to know my identity in relation to others, all kinds of people, and I learned to have boundaries with these people to let them know what was and wasn't okay. That way I could look after my well-being around them. And I'm largely talking about family here, but also applied to strangers or friends from the past who'd been challenging to be around, or co-workers, just whoever was triggering me. And so then parts of my true self then started to come out, like compassion for them. I could see and be okay with what was really going on for them, often when they were unaware of it, so I wasn't so triggered by what was happening to me. And new parts of my character and values began to show up as I learned to feel safe in my body and in the presence of people who had been previously triggering me. Another aspect of this was realizing something about my decision making. I didn't think I'd been making decisions all those years. I thought that I was just going with the flow because I thought if I didn't strongly feel about it one way or the other, I wouldn't get hurt, right? But by not strongly feeling about something and by not making a decision, I was still making a decision. I was letting whatever happen without taking charge and just letting others walk all over me or influence me, instead of actively filtering my life's decisions through my core values and beliefs. So I had to start uncovering my core values and beliefs, which was a really weird exercise because I'd never really connected with them before. I would look at a list of beliefs and values and think, I don't know, I don't care. I'd been in this I don't care energy for so long, right? But as I started to observe how I was moving through life and interacting with my work, family, and friends, I could see that I did have an inherent built-in set of core values and beliefs that were actually part of my DNA, right? A part of me that I'd been covering over with a blanket because I didn't want to be hurt or vulnerable or put myself out there. It was a really safe way of being, but I actually did have these very natural values within me. So for example, when I look back at the decisions I'd been making, I always led with love. Love has always been one of my highest values, and that made sense to me based on where I came from. My parents are very loving people, but love by itself can get you into a lot of hot water. So we can't just have one value where we make decisions. We need a strong set of them to guide us with wisdom. So I knew love was a core value of mine, and acknowledging that made sense to me. And I healed a part of how I saw myself from all those years. I had a newfound sense of compassion for who I was. Another core value I had, and if you're a fan of this channel and this content, this might be one of yours as well, is that I'm a strong giver. I give a lot because I care deeply about people, and I've always been in professions where I'm giving, looking after people and helping them. This value of giving, of course, has a shadow side. Firstly, we're socialized as women to overgive, to be valuable only when we're caretaking for children and men. But also, giving brings me a lot of joy and purpose, and that's not a bad thing at all. That's the light part of it. So I had to recognize that giving is a core value of mine and ask myself, how do I take that moving forward? How do I protect it and express it in a healthy way so that I can also receive as well, because I was also blocking receiving by giving so much. Now, I no longer find myself in relationships with people who only take, because I've learned how to receive and what it feels like to give and receive in a healthy flow. And honestly, I had so much energy that I was putting into relationships where I was the giver and they were the taker. I had to find an outlet for that energy, which is what I did in the form of this business. And that helped me start this channel and give my giving energy into a healthy expression of that value. So even if you think I've lost my identity in this toxic relationship and I've struggled with my identity my whole life and you have a pattern of trauma, your identity is still in there. It's just hidden over by these maladaptive patterns. And you can extract out who you are and harness that moving forward in a conscious way. This leads me to the last aspect that was really important for me in rebuilding my identity after feeling like a complete shell following my last toxic relationship. Building my own sense of self. This is really about internal identity and the work that you can do on your own, separate from other people. Now, this work comes down to self-trust. When I think about how I built self-confidence, self-esteem, self-love, it really comes down to the trust that I have with myself. The trust that I will show up for myself with my best interest at heart, with self-compassion, taking into account how I'm feeling that day, how much sleep I've had, what my internal resources are, and what's going on for me, as opposed to self-abandonment and just ignoring all those parts and just carrying on through. So it's about getting a sense of all of the parts within me and acting in accordance with what's right for me in that moment, rather than self-abandoning and always denying or ignoring myself in order to go with the flow or to not be too much. So if you're a woman, you might have this voice inside you that says, oh, that's selfish, I would say to you, that's actually your socialization speaking. That's the patriarchy. Men generally know how to look after themselves, to think about their needs and get them met. It's natural for them and it's natural for us too. We've just been told that we shouldn't do that and we should self-sacrifice instead. So I'm telling you now, it is your right as a human being to look after yourself primarily, because we can only fill other people's cups once our own cup is full. We cannot give from an empty cup. So how did I build self-trust? So that I could have more confidence and more self-esteem and feel like, yeah, I'm a cool person. I've got a lot to give others. Building self-trust came from knowing myself, knowing my needs, knowing what is and isn't right for me, and following through with action. My actions up until that point had been breaking my self-trust because I'd been abandoning myself, staying in relationships that weren't right for me. So turning the ship around and starting to act in accordance with what was right for me was what allowed me to grow self-trust, acting with self-compassion, loving all of those parts that had been acting out before, like lost children, bringing them all together and saying, it makes sense why you did that back then. I'm here for you. I love you. That is the process of self-love that I learned. Learning self-trust can only happen through actions. You cannot think your way into self-trust. You cannot talk your way into self-trust. That's probably gaslighting. It only happens through actual behavior, a somatic embodiment of showing you and all your parts you are finally showing up for yourself. It's who you are when no one's looking, like the saying goes. So if this is something you need help with, this is what I do. This is what I teach and I'm very passionate about. And I would love to help you. Just book a call, a free consultation call with me in the link below, and we can chat about how I can best help you moving forward. And in the meantime, here are some next step videos for you to watch so you can move one step closer to having a beautiful, healthy relationship with yourself. And for now, I will see you in the next video.